Hello, I'm Ronnie Eldridge. Welcome to Keeping Relevant. My guest, John Mollenkopf, is a distinguished professor of political science and sociology at the CUNY Graduate Center and the director of its Center for Urban Research. He has helped to define the field of urban policy, the role of race and immigration, and he's recognized for his analyses of U.S. urban politics. So I welcome you very much.
Great to be here.
Thank you. Let's just start right away about immigration. If you were mayor right now, what would you be doing?
Well, I'd be doing a lot of what Mayor Adams is doing, which is jumping up and down and screaming for help from the federal government. And the problem is that the president's hands are somewhat tied as to what he can do in terms of more money and making it possible for immigrants to work right away, asylees, seekers who are here. But that's what we need, really, is the ability of the people who are arriving to work, to take care of themselves, to begin to integrate, even if temporarily, into our city fabric, and to get out of shelters and out of the hands of government into running their own lives.
So could they take money from FEMA? I mean, it's an emergency.
It is an emergency. I'm not an expert on exactly what the regulations for FEMA are,
Yeah.
and most of the FEMA money that is for physical things like rebuilding housing after hurricanes and so on. So I don't know exactly what latitude there might be to rechannel the money, but definitely. I mean, how would you feel if 100,000 people showed up in your doorstep in the previous year and you've got to find a place for them?
I would be a little exasperated. But
the fact that they've done as well as they have,
Yeah.
I think, is remarkable.
That's interesting. But I don't want people to think that they're bad people. I mean,
Of course not.
but I find that there's an impatience with the migrants now.
The negative reaction from conservative
Right.
spokespeople negatively framing and disparaging these people as a big problem and maybe creating crime and other things, that's a completely inaccurate picture of who they are and who they will become in the city.
I don't know where our senators are. They've been so conspicuously missing, it seems to me.
Well, I'm sure that my neighbor, Senator Schumer, has
He's
been
busy
on the
trying.
phone constantly
hope
about
so.
this, even
So-
if he's not on TV about it.
So can a city succeed if it loses the middle class?
Well, cities always generate a lot of inequality because they're bringing people into the labor market at the low end, maybe sometimes people without skills, and giving them opportunities to rise. If cities are really successful, they're full of well-off professionals and managers, and even in New York City, very wealthy people. So cities tend to be more unequal by nature than other places, like more homogeneous suburbs that's sorted a certain group of people into a particular place. But I would say the cities really have to be providing upward mobility for people. That's the key. And as people go through their life course, have children, want more space, move to the suburbs, that's also part of the natural process. People are coming in and moving out the whole time. So think of it as the city as a pump. It has to pump effectively. It has to draw people in and lift them up.
And move them up. The different experiments that come to mind, I mean, one of the things is housing, the unaffordable housing that we have. If you go back to Mitchell-Lama days, those were housings that were supposed to provide transition.
Right.
But they never provided it.
Well, I don't know. I have friends who grew up in,
Right.
being advanced in age, I have friends who grew up in public housing in New York City in the 1950s and thought it was a really great place to live, and or if you look at Stuyvesant Town.
But did they move out, is what I'm asking.
Well, they still live in New York City, but
Yeah, but
they moved
in
out
many of those
house.
places, they still live in them.
Well, right.
And we
The
never
ten-
replace them. That's what my
The tenure in public housing, on average, is almost 30 years,
Yeah,
I
it's
think. So,
incredible. If we had more public housing, everything would be easy, right?
well,
Pretty easy.
we have a housing crunch. We have a housing problem. We probably, if you think about back to the 1970s, the city's population contracted substantially. A lot of housing got destroyed and abandoned and burned up. And real estate prices were very low. Somebody who bought a piece of property in the mid-70s when everybody else thought it was a bad deal actually made a very good deal. And as the city continued to be prosperous, with ups and downs, of course, from the mid-70s to the present, and the population increased, to its high point of possibly 8.6 million people a couple of years ago. We've dropped back from that. We haven't built enough housing to accommodate the growth of the people over time, the growth of the number of households. So, and that generates a crunch.
Why didn't we do that?
It's very hard to build anything in New York City.
True.
And it's expensive to build anything in New York City. And we want to build a lot of housing that's affordable for people of lesser means. So that means there has to be a stream of subsidies from somewhere to do that. And the federal government had basically stopped providing those streams of subsidy a long time ago. So what the city decided to do instead was cross-subsidy with private market rate housing, generating some subsidy that's cross-subsidizing quote-unquote affordable units in the private developments. That's what we've been doing for 20 years or so.
When did the federal government stop financing
Basically
public
in
housing?
the Reagan administration.
The Reagan.
Well, we stopped building public housing back in the early 70s. And it's sort of the Nixon era ended public housing as we knew it.
That was a great loss to us. No?
Yes, no, I mean, public housing makes a lot of sense in terms of efficiency of providing affordable housing as a mode. But we as a country, we pretty much definitively turned away from it. I don't see us being able to go back to it.
But my grandchildren can't afford, they're just at an age, they don't know where they're going to live in the city the way we were able to do that. You can't. So what happens then to the city?
Well, I would say, well, first of all, the city is aging. And as the older generations begin to fade out, they have emptied out neighborhoods. Take Canarsie, for example. My colleague and friend John Ryder wrote a book about Canarsie subtitled Jews and Italians Against Liberalism. If you remember, there were, as the neighborhood began to be more West Indian, there were a lot of protests over housing integration, school integration, and so forth. Now it's a completely solid middle-class West Indian neighborhood. So as one group moves out, another group has moved in and made a very solid community out of it. And interestingly, I think that the generation of African Americans that arrived, let's say, during and predominantly right after World War II, the migration from the South, a lot of that generation has either left the scene or retired back to places like North Carolina, where their families might have originally come from. And they might have bought a brownstone in Brooklyn for $15,000 back in the early 1970s and can sell it and retire and even help their family and so on. So, and a lot of the children of the old white ethnic middle class of New York City, they don't they don't want to live in the neighborhoods where they grew up and where their parents had homes. They want to be in Williamsburg or some
They want to go back
spot.
to somebody else.
Right. So there's always a lot of sort of generational sequencing and churn and so on. But I mean, the fact is we haven't produced enough housing for the demand, so the median price rises and makes it harder for people to live here, and people adapt to that in different ways. More people, young people crowded into a flat, sharing it, for example, or people going into neighborhoods they might not have thought of living in that are more distant and less, on the radar screen. I wouldn't say we're destroying our middle class. I would say that the housing situation stresses us really across the income span until you get near the top, really. So
why recently the discussion about the cost of childcare, for instance? I mean, I guess everything, it starts with a salary, right? It starts with your need.
If we had,
dynamic?
Again, another friend and neighbor, Bill de Blasio, has taken a lot of hits about his mayoralty, but pre-K and 3K for all made a huge difference in the quality of life for working families in New York City. And the U.S. as a whole needs to have publicly supported child care if we're going to expect women to go into the labor force and to have two-earner couples. We have to have affordable child care. So if New York had more affordable housing and more affordable child care, more people would move here. And that would probably recapitulate some of the problems we thought we had worked our way out. Is that most rapidly growing cities in the past couple of years have been places like Dallas and Fort Worth and Houston and Austin, Texas, which are still, building a lot of suburban housing at this point.
I see. They're undeveloped, and so they leave. But so, what is the future? I mean, is the future always going to be shifting? It's always going to. Is it like a checkerboard or something that one person goes up and the other?
Well, I don't think you can predict the future just from past trends.
Right.
If that were true, New York would be more like Detroit or Cleveland or St. Louis, because between 1970 and 1980, 1 million people moved out. We lost 600,000 jobs. The economic base was looking like it was going to be destroyed. And people might have been justified saying, and a lot of conservatives did say at that point, New York is going down the toilet. But that didn't happen. A lot of the interests across the class divide came together, said, we're going to save this city. We're going to do a bunch of things that will make this a better place to live. And the city took a lot of the in-rim property, and that's what the Koch 10-year housing plan was based on. Let's rebuild this housing. So there are neighborhoods in the South Bronx that people thought might have been just rubble forever that got rebuilt. So our capacity to come together to make investments in our city that will help us be vital and successful and robust, that's what makes the difference in terms of what our history will be. Right now, we're in a bit of a crisis with work from home, decline of population, people having moved out, and a lot of pundits are writing about how these, Sunbelt cities are going to do a lot better than New York, which is the biggest loser in terms of population over the last couple of years. I think it's a great opportunity, this moment of change, and I think anybody who's ever bet against New York in the long haul has lost. So I don't know exactly how we'll work our way out of this situation, but actually having 100 or 200,000 unexpected immigrants arrive could be ultimately one of the solutions.
Yeah, but famous European cities, they don't collapse, do they?
There are a lot of shrinking cities in Europe. they have old industrial cities that have lost population and vitality also. You know, the Ruhr Valley in Germany, for example. But, you know, the elites never abandoned the central city in Europe the way many elites abandoned cities like, well, I don't want to disparage any cities, so I'm not going to name any of them. But
oh, come on, you could name
well,
one.
Detroit is a classic example of urban
And they were really in Detroit.
Well, yes and no. I mean, Ford built factories outside of Detroit in World War II, and racial conflict and class conflict in Detroit.
Race was really the defining.
Race and class, I think. You know, the Auto Workers Union produced a lot of good-paying jobs. Detroit was a very rich city I mean, the middle class of Detroit was very affluent for a long period of time until sort of globalization and neoliberalism, and let's put the auto plants in Mexico and not in Detroit.
So you're optimistic.
I am optimistic. Well, maybe.
Are you always optimistic?
Well,
about life?
There are a number of things I'm worried about.
Yeah. Like what?
Like the 2024 presidential election.
What is going to happen in a country that's so now divided and so
polarized?
Polarized, and why?
Political scientists have had lots of debates about how exactly you explain this, but my take on it is this: that if you talk about the era of global competition, maybe from roughly 1970 to the present, in which so much of the industrial base of the country has been hollowed out. You know, when I was a kid and you went to the hardware store, it was full of American-made products. You could get like a really nice hammer that was probably made in Wisconsin or something like that. Now we buy a hammer from China for half the price that we would have to pay to make it in the US. And I think there's a whole sort of blue-collar part of the United States that suffered from the commitment to global competitiveness and global free trade. And the Republicans have sensed that and built their base on it. So they're attacking Eastern, urban, educated elites who are interested in global free movement of people and goods and ideas and money. And they're mobilizing resentment. And there's a lot of resentment out there. And immigrants are a key part of that. Because populations are changing, and why are these people getting jobs instead of my kid? You know, I spend the summers up in southern Maine in a town that, when I was a little kid, was nationally the leading producer of a very high quality lightweight wool for Palm Beach suits. And the mills went away. The little town, initially powered by dams and river water and then steam and coal, all of that kind of evaporated, and now the town has a lot of problems with kids with no future and doing drugs, and it's a kind of sad place. And that's an example that you could replicate across many parts of the country. It's ironic that if you look at the median incomes of congressional districts now, Democrats hold 80% of the seats in the districts that are the top 20%, and the Republicans hold 60 or 70% of the ones in the lowest two tiers. Why should the Republican Party be representing the working class and the Democrats be representing the professionals and managers?
Yeah, that's a switch.
It is a switch. it's something the Democratic Party presents itself as the defender of the working class, and in many ways it is. But Democrats have led this sort of globalization shift in the overall economy, and Republicans, even though they're really corporate in their heart of hearts, I think, sees the old, working class resentment of this change and has mobilized it.
Do you believe that the majority of the people really believe in the Republican Party?
Right now, I was raised as a Republican. All of my parents and grandparents.
In Maine?
Well, I grew up mostly in Cincinnati, Ohio.
Oh, really?
In a Lutheran family. My grandfather on my mother's side, was a very strong Republican. He was a physician in Silver Spring, Maryland. My grandmother was a precinct captain for the Republican Party in Montgomery County, Maryland, and she would always say, "You can't trust those Democrats. They'll vote dead people. You got to look at every single voter and make sure they're..." So, but the Republican Party that I'm descended from was very strongly shaped by the Civil War, by reform, by being against corrupt Democrats, by standing for Protestant values. The current Republican Party doesn't seem to have any of that.
No.
They're just a party of resentment and rage, as nearly as I can tell.
They have no principles either, right?
They certainly don't seem to. Well, the principle of winning based on mobilizing resentment, that's their principle.
And repression, they are...
Well, take it any way you can get it is evidently how they're thinking.
But the thought of, it's so interesting to me because they don't want any control someplace, but then they want everybody's lives control others.
Well, it's a kind of marriage of this working class resentment. Working class isn't quite the right word for it, but with a kind of evangelical Christian supermoralism and around issues like abortion, for example, or gay rights, or trans kids, or what books should be allowed in the library.
The library and the children and telling the parents what they can do or can't,
Well, they sell it as allowing the parents to tell the libraries what to do.
Yeah, but it's not.
Well, it's ridiculous. I have good friends who teach in Florida universities, public universities. Their tenure has been abridged, more or less. And they teach about things like racial inequality and political repression and so forth, and they're very concerned that somebody may say, well, the governor said you are not allowed to talk about these things.
And that gets brought up in a classroom or something.
Well, it has a chilling effect on, I think people are actually leaving higher education in Florida, professors, and looking for jobs elsewhere as a result of that environment.
It's incredible. So are we going to be able to win this year? Pull this off? Express enough truth?
This goes back to whether I'm an optimist or not. There are a lot of headwinds. We have a lot going for us as Democrats, and I'll out myself as a Democrat. Although, in my teaching, I make sure to include conservative perspectives around policy issues, because I think we don't want to be locked into some sort of groupthink around, democratic liberalism. We need to be self-critical. But as long as the president holds up, and as long as we can talk about the actual record of the administration in terms of the investments that we've made And as long as we can talk about, you know, the Republicans like to attack woke people. They seem to be the ones who are really woke at this point. If there's a culture war, they're the cultural warriors.
Yes, it's
And,
true.
you know, a sense of freedom and liberty should be on the side of the Democrats these days, since Republicans seem to want to take it away.
And if we have some semblance of truth, honesty,
Right.
the distortion is unbelievable. It's, well, now we can't end the program this way. So we have to come up.
Well, let's mobilize the urban vote and the suburban vote.
Definitely. and to get more people to vote. And we didn't even talk about
Right.
our new voting systems and how that helps us. But we don't have enough people voting in the city. It's shocking to me. It really is.
Well, turnout is correlated with things like education and income pretty strongly. And, you know, we have a lot of non-citizens. We have a lot of people with low incomes, low education levels, and that's inevitably going to dampen our turnout rate compared to New Rochelle or something, an upper middle class suburb.
Do we have to wait till young people get to college before they begin to study government?
We've done a bad job on civic education in the
Absolutely.
schools.
Yeah.
We need to do more.
I had a great civics teacher in 7th grade at Joan of Arc Junior High School. Wonderful. And I give him a lot of credit, almost all of it, for that and my family, who was always interested. But
You know, there's a lot of alienation and skepticism and that's not an irrational response to looking at American politics and thinking that, you know, politicians don't really care about me. They just come around election time and say they like me so they can get my vote. So that cynicism we need to overturn that. We need to convince people that they can go out and they can get engaged and they express their point of view and they can be heard and they can have an influence on outcomes.
well, I hope we do that.
Absolutely.
All right. Thank you very much.
Most welcome.